Greetings, my name is Bilal Hafeez and I'm head of GTN FX strategy at Nomura. Over the past 3 weeks, I've been crisscrossing the globe talking to investors and corporates about the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on markets. So on this podcast, I'm going to talk about some of my observations from those meetings, my views on the world, and particularly my non-consensus view that the dollar will head down over the course of the year. I'll also talk about some of my understanding of how Trump makes deals. And then finally, I'll also touch on some of the unique aspects of Trump, why he's popular amongst certain segments of the US population, and also how he's not a conventional Republican. So making analogies to previous Republican administrations won't make as much sense. So anyway, a few weeks ago, I started my world tour with the US. I arrived in Seattle a day after Donald Trump's inauguration on January 21st and was greeted by over 100,000 people taking part in the Women's March Against the New President. A week later, as I was leaving the US, the airport was filled with protesters against President Trump's executive order banning refugees from Syria and immigration from 7 mainly Muslim countries. I returned to Europe, when Trump and his advisors started to talk down the dollar and questioning whether the euro was too undervalued. And then last week, the final leg of my world tour, I was in Asia, which was the beginning of the Chinese New Year, the year of the rooster, which signifies loyalty and punctuality. The Trump news flow, interestingly, last week was much more conciliatory. He reiterated the US's support for the One China policy. He had an amicable summit with Japan's Prime Minister Abe, and he hinted at a phenomenal fiscal package that will come down the chute later on this year. Now, in terms of reaction of investors to some of my view is that we need to focus much more on trade's Trump policy rather than his promises of reflation and fiscal stimulus. And as a result, the dollar should head down. Yet most investors seem to be beguiled by his promises on the fiscal side and deregulation. And as a result, most people like to see US equities go up, US yields go up, and also the US dollar to go up. But despite his surprising victory and unorthodox governing style, I have to say that it's becoming apparent that what he can do by himself without Congress is starting to show some limits. So, for example, we've had delays in many of his cabinet confirmations. There's been the Supreme Court reversal of his travel ban. And there's also an interesting emergence of a Democrat version of the Tea Party movement with groups such as the Town Hall Project 2018 and others. So there are signs that there will be resistance from many different quarters for many of his policies. And one has to remember that when Obama first got elected in 2008 and came into power 2009, he did have Congress on side, as both the House and the Senate were Democrat, yet the Tea Party movement did restrict many of Obama's initiatives when he in his first year or so. So therefore, any fiscal package, even if it is promised by Trump, should be taken with a pinch of salt. It has to go through Congress, which is a hurdle in itself. And in some cases, like infrastructure spending, which many people are focusing on to help the US economy, many Republicans are against it. And so President Trump may actually need the Democrats to help push it through. But as I alluded to earlier, the Democrats, even though they may agree with infrastructure spending, may take an anti-Trump position rather than look at the policy in itself. So as a result, I think we'll have a protracted period of haggling around the fiscal stimulus. And the risk here is that the market's expectations are running quite high, yet data in the US may not necessarily validate those already high growth expectations. Now, the area where Trump is most unconstrained is actually on trade policy. According to various US trade acts, he can bypass Congress to impose tariffs on other countries. He can actually instruct the Treasury to intervene in currency markets without requiring the Fed to approve. And we have to remember that Donald Trump's key policy target is really to revive the US manufacturing sector, which he believes has been unfairly hit by globalization. And so I think his strategic aims are to attract foreign investment into the US, to threaten or impose tariffs on imports that compete with US manufacturers, and also, and this is perhaps more controversial amongst many of our clients, I also think he is looking for a weak dollar. And the reason I say that is if you look across most manufacturing countries around the world, particularly in Asia, many of them have actually pursued various forms of weak currency policies. We've seen heavy intervention by many Asian countries over the last 10, 15 years. And this has really been one of the issues that Trump has taken with Asian policymakers. And it has helped those countries export. And in recent years, when countries have devalued their currency, so for example, when Prime Minister Abe came into power around 4 years ago in Japan, he initiated a series of policies which saw the yen weaken significantly, and thereafter saw the manufacturing sector and Japanese growth pick up sharply. Last year, after Brexit, the pound tumbled, and since then we've seen a big pickup in manufacturing in the UK off the back of a weak currency. So there is some virtues in having a weak currency, at least to begin with. Now, many investors appear to be focused on a possible dollar surge if the US imposes import tariffs or some kind of border adjustment tax. Now, this is often based on some kind of theoretical argument that markets will offset any tariffs to make sure that prices between countries are the same. For me, that's more of a theoretical argument. In practice, when the US has imposed tariffs, whether on certain products or on a broad base of products, the dollar has typically weakened against the major currency pairs. And he also, in a Wall Street Journal interview, did say that the US may need to get the dollar down if a change in tax was to lead to a stronger dollar. And so I think that there is scope for a policy around a weak currency to emerge, whether verbally or through actual currency intervention itself. And you have to remember the US was intervening regularly in currency markets up until the mid-1990s. Now, in terms of trade wars, when I was in the US, there were many more fears that we'd see an actual trade war with China. And many people did see the thesis that the US is somehow trying to contain the rise of China. Asian investors, on the other hand, were much more sanguine on that. And they saw that the US would not really benefit from such a trade war with China, despite his rhetoric. And I have to say, on one of my flights, I did get a chance to read Donald Trump's 1987 book, The Art of the Deal, and he did write in there that I never get too attached to one deal or one approach. And the other thing he said in there was the worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is seem desperate to make it. The best thing you can do is deal from strength, and leverage is the biggest strength you can have. And later on in that book, he talks about how you should sort of project strength. You should, even if you don't have it. And so I think much of his rhetoric towards China is just that. He's just trying to make the cost to China appear very high. And so it would make it easier for him to have a deal with them over the course of this year. And I think it's interesting that the Chinese yuan and also many other Asian currencies have actually stopped weakening since the beginning of this year, which would be one of the things Donald Trump would be looking for. He'd want the dollar to be the weaker currency, not the Asian currencies. He also, interestingly, in return, you could say, he's reversed course on his apparent opposition to the One China policy. And the other thing, something a few investors did point out to me, was that Jack Ma, the Chinese internet entrepreneur, has been in the US of late, and many thought that as an indication that there was some kind of communication on various agreements between the US and China that would likely to be forthcoming. Now, outside of Trump, many people are also looking for the dollar to strengthen off the back of the Fed. My view around that is that we've had 3 years of tightening by the Fed already. We had Fed taper in 2013. We've had a couple of hikes since then. The dollar's gone up around 20%. Yet if you look at previous tightening phases, so the 1994 tightening phase, where the Fed hiked almost every meeting, and the most recent one in 2004 up until 2006, in both cases, the dollar actually fell during those tightening phases. So it's not clear to me that even if the Fed was to continue tightening, that the dollar should necessarily continue to go up. If anything, the dollar appears to have run ahead of where it has been in previous tightening phases. Now, one reason why I think the dollar won't do as well this year if the Fed was to hike is that inflation is higher, which means that real interest rates are likely to fall rather than rise. The other is that other central banks now are in a position to also tighten policy, or at least reverse their super easy policy that they've had over the last 3 years. So the dollar has really benefited from the fact that the Fed's been tightening, while other central banks like the ECB and the Bank of Japan have been easing. This year, that's going to change. At some point this year, the ECB will start to talk about taper. And meanwhile, the Bank of Japan already is starting to raise its 0% yield curve target. It seems to be targeting 0.1% at the moment. So I think there is going to be a shift in the relationship between US yields and FX. And as a result, I think the dollar will struggle over the course of this year. And I think dollar yen could head down towards the 105 level. Meanwhile, I think the euro could do well. We have to contend with the French elections, which will hold the euro back for now. But I think that assuming Le Pen doesn't win, I think the euro could then start to benefit from the fact that the European growth is actually quite strong. Euro area growth is actually higher than US growth. And as a result, I think that the ECB has much scope to talk about an exit from QE. Now, finally, some observations on how to think about Donald Trump in the context of US politics. I think that he has confounded many in his first candidacy for the Republican Party and his presidency itself. And I think one of the paradoxes of Trump is that many of his policies he actually holds are actually Democrat policies. So, for example, his position on trade, which is anti-WTO, anti-free trade, is actually a Democrat position and more of a liberal left-wing position. So if one recalls 10, 15 years ago, there were many, many protests against the WTO, particularly in Seattle, which was one of the famous ones. And they were the makeup of the protesters were people from the left, not from the right. And Trump has actually adopted a left-wing position. Most Republicans are pro-free trade. So this is one of the paradoxes. And another one, interestingly, is his position on immigration, because traditionally, at least in the 80s and 90s, anti-immigration was actually a position of the Democrat Party. So, for example, in President Reagan's 1980 debate with George Bush, so this is a Republican view, he talked about, and I quote, "Rather than talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them, the immigrants, to come here legally with a work permit, and while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes." Meanwhile, Jimmy Carter, who was running against Reagan, said, "We will oppose any legislation designed to allow workers into this country to undercut US wages." And then later in the 90s, Bill Clinton, when he was running for his second term in 96, in his campaign position, talked about how in 92, before he came into power, our borders might as well not have existed. The border was under-patrolled. What patrols there were under-equipped. Drugs flowed freely. Illegal immigration was rampant. Criminal immigrants deported after committing crimes in America returned the very next day to commit crimes again. And so the Democrats over the 80s and the 90s were very much the party against immigrants. And it's interesting that during that period, Donald Trump was a member of the Democrat Party. And so when the Republicans flipped to take on a more anti-immigration stance, Trump switched his allegiance to the Republicans. So I think Trump in many ways is somewhat of an enigma, and many of his policies are actually not orthodox Republican policies. They're much more left-wing Democrat policies, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's had some crossover appeal. Now, as a visitor to the US from Europe, what is striking is how social and cultural issues, rather than economic policies, divide Democrat and Republican supporters. So even though Trump has adopted many of these left-wing positions or Democrat positions, Republicans still support him. And this is because he's adopted their social policies, which relate to things on the place of religion in the state, on issues around the right for women to choose to have an abortion or not, and so on. And so it seems almost like what matters for the Republican Party more is whether you take on the social and cultural and conservative values of the party rather than the economic policies of the party. They're much more fluid. And this is one of the reasons why I think Trump has a lot more leeway on some of his policies than would otherwise be apparent. The other thing I would point out, though, is that many people are focusing on the fact that Trump has very low approval ratings, which is true. It's the lowest of any incoming president since World War II. And so some are saying this is a constraint on his policies. But I would say that there's a huge divergence amongst Democrats and Republicans on this. So only 12% of Democrats approve of Trump, while 80% of Republicans approve of him. So although he's the least popular president, if you remove sort of the Democrat side of the population, the Republican base itself love him. And so this is a factor we have to take into account. And I think it's also part of the reason why his inaugural speech was quite partisan, and his willingness to ignore the complaints of Democrat voters. So his popularity amongst Republican supporters would also limit what congressional Republicans can do to halt Trump's economic policies. So time will tell whether Trump will maintain this level of popularity, but for the next several months at least, I think he'll be able to pursue much of his policy, which in the end, I think will be negative for the dollar. And I think we should just watch this space. Now, finally, I would just say everything I've talked about here is available in our various research notes. I recently wrote a note saying letter from Asia. I also wrote a letter from Trump's America, and all of these are available on our website, on Nomura Connect. So feel free to go to those sites to have a read of those publications. Thank you very much.